Okay, thanks for coming back after the break. That was a great panel this morning, too. And now we have the benefit of another great panel with 4 scintillating speakers. Scintillating. I want you to rise to the occasion, lady and gentlemen. This is a panel on governance, accountability, and transparency, where we might actually spend a little bit of time talking about institutions and the kinds of arrangements at a systemic level that will capture some of the responsibilities and help sustain this new fiscal relationship. The themes that are in your agenda, which they'll be touching upon, will include questions like, does the nation-to-nation relationship require transfer of fiscal powers? How can we assess fiscal capacity required to exercise the transfer of jurisdiction? What capacity, capability, and institution building are required to financially sustain the transfer of this jurisdiction we've been talking about? And what are the kinds of capacity building activities needed to advance self-government? What has been effective and what hasn't worked? And how can reciprocal accountability be articulated and practiced between the parties? So let me just introduce you to our 4 speakers. Many of them have been with us for the period of time, and you know them well. First and foremost, let me introduce Riley Yesno. Riley comes to us from Thunder Bay and is a member of the Eamentom First Nation. Close enough? Okay, you can fix it when you come up. Riley's got lots of claim to fame in her own right, because if she didn't, she wouldn't have been selected to be one of the members of the Prime Minister's Youth Council. So she's going to talk to us about her own view of many things, I suspect, but also what's been happening here for the last 2 days, and how, like the leaders of today that are up on the podium with her, she truly has got a lot of bandwidth and a lot of runway ahead of her compared to the rest of us who've been at it for a little bit longer. So the important views of her as a leader, as a youthful leader, and how she perceives all these things, I think will be of interest to us all. The next person who's going to come up to the podium is Scott Serson, who's known to many of you here for his work with Canadians for a New Partnership, with his work with the AFN, and as a former Deputy Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Our third speaker is the visionary Stephen Kafkwe, who thought up the concept and is the president of Canadians for a New Partnership to try to engage all of Canada in this important journey that will help us complete Canada so that my friend Ovid can feel like he too can be part of Canada. And he was also, of course, former Premier of the Northwest Territories. And then finally, we'll conclude the panel's deliberations with Ovid Mercredi, who's known to all of you for his many years of work in serving First Nations, but also being a nation builder for all of Canada. So that completes the panel. I don't need to say anything more about them. They'll come up. We'll try to break at around 12:30, where we'll have lunch served, and then come back and complete the 2 days deliberations with our keynote speaker, who will be Ovid, talking to us about how to pull all of this together. So without further ado, it's a great panel this morning. I'll ask Riley to come up and start the process for us.
You're welcome. All right. Hello. So before I start, I'll just give you a little bit of background about me. So I'm a high school student. I'm 17. I'm a member of the Prime Minister's Youth Council, which is basically an advisory council to Justin Trudeau on issues of importance to Canadian youth, which is pretty much everything. And so I'm sorry that I'm not an expert at something like governance or intergovernmental fiscal relations like a lot of the other panelists and speakers you've heard over the last 2 days. The sort of experience I have in relation to that, I come from Eamentom First Nation, which is Treaty 3 territory, and it's kind of, I guess you could say, close to Thunder Bay. My dad used to be the band manager there, and my uncle Harvey Yesno is the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation, and I also work with Anishinaabe Nation's executive, so that's about all the experience I have there, but hopefully it'll be something. And also, just forewarning, I'm not a huge numbers person, so that might not be the greatest ever, but I hope I can provide the perspective of not only a youth voice, but also that of someone with experience of living on a reservation and whose repercussions of lack of self-governance and autonomy that these communities have directly affects. And so hopefully that is of a little bit of value. So, like I said, while it's not my area of expertise, I do see how the theme of this event is really important when talking about reconciliation in Canada in general, and that is something that I am super passionate about and have a great more deal of opinions on. So I might jump around here a bit, and I might not totally stay on topic with the panel, but I hope that's okay. So I'm probably going to echo a lot of what's been said this over the past few days too. And I'll try my best to answer the questions. In regard to the first question that is laid out in the agenda being, does a nation-to-nation relationship require a transfer of fiscal powers? In my personal opinion, yes, to put it very simply. I believe that there are three pillars of reconciliation, being reconciliation between Indigenous people and the government, reconciliation between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and reconciliation between Indigenous people and themselves. And when you're talking about the transfer of fiscal powers and a new fiscal relationship, that is a huge one when you're talking about improving the circumstance or the situation of the relationship between Indigenous people and the government, that pillar of reconciliation. But it does contribute to improving the circumstance of all three, in my opinion. So more importantly than a relationship, more importantly than that relationship, though, is, I think, a word that has been tossed around a lot over the past few days, and that word being equality. And I think when you're talking about reconciliation, that is really, really fundamental. And here's why, and a few examples of why I think that that is so imperative. So one example, and again, has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but anyways, one example of something would be something like language. So Indigenous language in Canada is obviously underfunded when you compare it to something in schools, when you compare it to something like French. It's underfunded in Thunder Bay, where I go to school, and obviously across Canada. However, even if it were given the same amount of monetary resources, that does not equate to equality. As Canadian government and Canadian society as a whole has deemed knowing an Indigenous language less valuable than knowing that of, say, French. So, like, when I go to school, I'm offered the Ojibwe class and I'm offered the French class, but I continue to only take the French class even though Ojibwe is my native language, because I know that outside of that classroom, the government and Canadian society has given Indigenous language no merit. So even though technically I have both resources available to me, it still isn't equality in the grand scheme of things. Yes, where are we here? And so, like I said, despite the resources, they're still not looked at as equal outside of the monetary value. And another example, and a huge, huge one when you're talking about reconciliation, arguably, in my opinion, one of the most important, is when you're talking about education. And this is where self-government, or lack thereof, is really comes into effect. For someone like me, I went to school, it's the John C. Yesno School of Education in Abbotsford First Nation. I went there till about grade 2, and it's a school that goes up to grade 8. In JK, I won the Student of the Year award for the entire school. Yeah, good me. Go me. That's what I'm really proud of. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I won it in JK. They also wanted to skip me up 2 grades right at the beginning. And at the time, I was like, oh yeah, look at me go. But now that I realize that there was nothing extraordinary about the way I was doing things, other than the fact that, first of all, I was one of the only kids that went regularly, and I realized very quickly that my peers around me still did not know their ABCs, that they could not identify colors, that a lot of them still were at very low speaking levels, and in this school, we had, computers, books, all these things. It wasn't obviously as well funded as education in like urban areas or off reserve. However, there was resources available, but they were still not being used to the best of their abilities. And I quickly realized that that was because my mother and like a lot of us in this room, I'm sure, were instilled at a very young age that education was the way to success, that education was important. She did things like watch Blue's Clues with me and read and all of these things that a vast majority of my peers were not. So more so than having money in education, that's where you have to look at your community and its needs and say, there needs to be more money in social programs, there needs to be more money in parenting and all of these sorts of things, because what is the point of having all of this money in education if the people and your students aren't able to use it to the best of their abilities? So, where am I here? Yeah, I said that. And so keep in mind also that I have no professional experience with this here, but when I spoke to my father about that, and more recently I went to the Edmonton Education Authority and I talked to them about it, they said they totally recognize that, but because, that they totally recognize that to be true, but they have no money that they can allocate there because the money that's in education is set in education and they can't take that and move it. So, like I said, that doesn't make any sense. And for a community, my community, that has as of 2014, had a population of 60% of them being under the age of 25. You have so many kids that need these social programs going up to be able to use their education effectively. And so this is where self-governance would be so important and crucial and is really necessary, because on a community-to-community basis, while it might say, yeah, you should have however X million dollars in education, for this community, it doesn't make sense at this point in time. So a huge thing for reconciliation is building up these communities from the ground up, and without a change in fiscal relationship and allowance for self-governance, that is just simply not achievable. And now talking about the main theme of this panel, or one of them, being accountability and transparency. So in terms of accountability, specifically with the government, I have two ideas. So this is, again, me being a little less negative here. But I have two ideas with no firm plan of action, but rather personal opinions and ideas. So an example of a way to hold the government more accountable, in my opinion, was something that a fellow council member brought up at our last in-person meeting with the Prime Minister in Montreal. Our meeting was focused on reconciliation, and he suggested that, and his name's Joe Darcel, he's from Winnipeg, he suggested that the government have a nonpartisan, non-government affiliated group that kind of grades the government on how well they have been doing in terms of working towards the calls of action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that way, hopefully, he said that it would prompt them that would make them accountable for what they have done, and it would also prompt them to expedite the process of reconciliation quickly and fulfill those calls to action in a quicker manner. Admittedly, they didn't have much to say about that, but I, again, think that would be a great idea. And so another thing is, from my perspective, it just doesn't make sense to me that government parties can use the treatment, the equity, and the status of these nations as a campaign promise, as opposed to a basic, universally understood acknowledgement that needs to be worked towards, regardless of party or person in power. And youth and Indigenous people in general should not have to be forced to vote on the basis of who will best provide them with their basic fundamental rights as Indigenous people and as a nation. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And you have to have some sort of across-the-board negotiation written by Indigenous people and by these communities of equality, not what one person thinks you're deserving of. So furthermore, something that I have always thought, but has only been reinforced by the conference and the speakers, is that there cannot be a standardization of what is an acceptable government and what is an acceptable form of government, and it has to be dictated based on a community basis, like I said. So last month, I met with Nathan Obed, who's the president of the ITK and Canada's national leader of the Inuit people. He was at the Prime Minister's meeting as well in Montreal, and he was telling us about how he was in negotiation, or rather, sort of like a dispute with government officials about two communities in Nunavut. And he said, these communities speak virtually no English. They have no formal forms of election for their chief. Hunting is pretty much their only way of getting resources. And they have pretty much just refused to assimilate to modern Canadian status quo. And he said that he brought these people up there to come and visit and everything. And that they were really heavily critical of the way that they ran their communities, and he said that they called it archaic. And this is where a lot of his frustration began to set in, because he said these are people who have lived like this for thousands of years, and it has worked for their communities for thousands of years, and they see no need and have no want to change. So how is it up to you to deem what is acceptable and what is an appropriate form of government that is the same colonialist assimilation type of thinking that leads us to things like residential schools? So that is just something else I wanted to say. And finally, that reconciliation, I think, always has to be kept in mind, that it is not the first step or something we need to have in order to move forward. It is the deliverable that comes from achieving the other actions first. So you have to fix all of these problems that have been laid out, things like this, all of these the fiscal relationship. You have to talk about boil water advisories, you have to talk about murdered and missing Aboriginal women, and once you start fixing all of these things, reconciliation is the end product that comes from receiving all of that. It is ongoing. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about how to move forward as a country. And yeah, those are my opinions pretty much on all of that and the conference this weekend. So thank you very much.